There's a story about James Cameron who met with a bunch of Hollywood producers back in the day to try to convince them that he was the right man to take charge of the sequel to Ridley Scott's Alien. So the story goes, they were reluctant to give it to him. So Cameron took a piece of paper, wrote the word alien on it, added an S to pluralize it, put two vertical lines through the S to make a dollar sign, and showed it to the executives. They were duly impressed, they made the deal, and the rest is history. Now, whether that story is accurate or apocryphal or whatever, I couldn't help imagining a similar meeting between Matt Haig and his agent when Haig was pitching the idea for the Midnight Library. I'm picturing the two of them sitting there in some swanky hotel bar, Haig rabbiting on about yoga or his latest Twitter feud or whatever, and then his agent says, "So, Matt, this magical library idea, I'm not so sure about it." Haig smiles, enigmatically, and he asks the waiter to bring a pen and paper. Then they both sit there in silence for about 3 minutes until the waiter returns, which kind of ruins the mysterious revelatory mood that Haig is going for, but nonetheless. So anyway, Matt takes the paper and he draws a little face, a disgruntled face. He slides it across the table and his agent looks at it and says, "Yeah, it's a frown. So what?" Matt holds up a finger and then slowly turns the paper upside down. His agent sits back. He's silent for a few moments, his mouth hanging open. Then he raises his pink gin and tonic and says, "Matt, my old mucker, you've done it again." Welcome to the Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. I look at literature through a political lens, and today we're talking about The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. So, this is going to be a rant because I hated this book. It made me very angry. You know, I mentioned in the review I did of A Gentleman in Moscow, if a book is just badly written, but it doesn't have any kind of pernicious message, I've no real interest in punching down and ripping it to pieces. But the existence of this book, the fact that it's out there in the world being read by millions of people, is, in my opinion, an affront to people who suffer from mental health problems. This is a dangerous book. It's ideologically poisonous and morally irresponsible. Now, I'm not going to assume that the author is a bad person, necessarily, but even if we're being charitable, at a bare minimum, I would say he's misguided. Either way, this thing deserves to be torn apart. So the message of The Midnight Library is essentially that you can live, laugh, love your way out of depression. This novel, and I mean that strictly nominally, is so lightweight, I'm surprised it didn't blow away as I was reading it. This book has the philosophical depth of an Instagram post by someone who thinks drinking coffee is a personality trait. It has the intellectual heft of an inspirational cat meme from 2003 that's posted on Facebook by an auntie who believes in chemtrails as a condolence message in response to the news of her niece getting laid off. It has the passion and zest and energy of an informational pamphlet you might find in a doctor's waiting room on the subject of senior incontinence. It reads like a cynical, pandering, manipulative exercise in bullshit that's aimed at rather dim people. It is overbearingly smug, twee and saccharine. It's juvenile, asinine, inane, and worse than all of that, it is mean-spirited, reactionary, and devoid of compassion. So, let's jump into a review before we get to the politics. So, the plot of the book is very simple. It's explained on the back in a few short lines. Nora's life has been going from bad to worse. Then, at the stroke of midnight, on her last day on Earth, she finds herself transported to a library. There, she is given the chance to undo her regrets and try out each of the other lives she might have lived. Which raises the ultimate question: with infinite choices, what is the best way to live? Then, after the epigraph and before the first chapter starts, there's a quote from the book explaining the library idea again, just in case you'd forgotten it since reading the back, or in case you literally can't wait until it's explained again using those same words a few chapters later. So the signposting of the plot and the central mechanic of the book begin even before the narrative has started. So I have a huge problem with the premise of this book, this supposed link between depression and regret. It's overly simplistic and nothing in the book is convincing in terms of making that premise credible. In general, the plot is dull, predictable, and badly executed. It's full of redundancy and repetition. Everything is over-explained, heavy-handed. This book is like having something boring and toxic spelled out for you interminably by someone who can't spell. So we have a fantastical, magical library as the central conceit of the book, and that's fine. That kind of thing has been done quite a few times, and it can be effective. But Haig makes a mess of it. So firstly, you have this overbearingly earnest sentiment woven throughout the book about libraries and books and librarians. And look, I'm a massive book nerd, I'm a proponent of reading, and I do think that reading can be immersive, magical, transformative. But the kind of trite adoration that suffuses this text is just painful to read. Going on about librarians as soul-enhanced search engines and the like, it's just cringeworthy. Another thing that irritates me about the plot is that Haig tries to indulge in fantasy or magical realism on one hand, even going for some religious overtones with the librarian, Mrs. Elm, as some kind of godly figure. But then he also tries to give a rational explanation for the existence of the library. And this ends up with, firstly, a very overdone sci-fi trope of the many worlds theory, which he executes really badly. And then it also just leads to a lot of unnecessary and not very believable asides about what happens to the other Noras, for example, after she leaves each life. Haig tries to tie everything up nicely and logically, plot-wise, but it just doesn't work because the idea isn't logical, and the way he presents it is clumsy and full of inconsistencies. Now, the last thing to talk about in terms of the plot is the absolutely enormous plot hole that enraged me almost more than the shitty politics that this book espouses. Now, I don't normally care about minor plot holes. Almost any fictional story can be picked apart if you're determined enough, and I don't really think that's a worthwhile thing to do with art in general. But this glaring issue massively affects your enjoyment of the book, because you have to read through the results of it over and over and over, and it's maddening. So the issue is that Nora jumps into these alternative lives with no knowledge or memory of her past in that life. She doesn't become that version of herself. She just inhabits their corporeal form for a little while. And so predictably, the result of this is an absolute mess. She doesn't know what she thinks or how she feels about anything. She doesn't know what her own situation is, anything from family to health to mental health to employment, whatever. She has no memory of her life up to that point, which means she doesn't know her friends, her partner, her children, which leads to a lot of sticky ethical problems. Not to mention that she makes decisions while in the body of this other person, basically, then leaves that person with the consequences, which could be finding herself in bed with a stranger, for example. And again, Haig goes out of his way to say that this isn't fantasy, it's real. This is happening. He has set those parameters. So every time Nora jumps into a life, we have to deal with the same stupid nonsense. She has to do detective work to find out her job, her address, which of her family members are dead. Everyone around her is confused by her complete lack of knowledge. So you get this repeated formula of people saying, "Are you okay? Are you mad? You seem confused. You seem different. Have you forgotten about X? Do you have dementia? Have you been lobotomized?" Not to mention the fact that Nora is confused all the time, just stumbling around in these lives. Mostly just saying the word "what." It is so tiresome to read through that again and again. So if this is her experience, of course she's going to go back to her own shitty life at the end, because at least she knows what's going on and she won't be constantly bewildered. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is Nora's slow realization of the plot hole. She says things like, "That was confusing. I don't want to go back there. Entering a life wasn't the same as entering an emotion. Dylan deserved the other Nora. She was taking somebody's place." The now familiar question raised itself. How could she just join into a life that she was years late for? She had joined the movie halfway. So not only do we have to read through this infuriating plot hole over and over, but you have to suffer the author inarticulately proclaiming and lamenting the existence of his own plot hole. How on earth do you arrive at that for the key mechanic of your story? Now, at the end, Haig tries to make this out to be a deliberate choice, as a way to make her see the value of her root life. But that doesn't make it any less annoying to read, and it also just doesn't make sense. She never got to try living another life. She just got dropped into a really confusing and stressful snapshot of someone else's life, and then had to pretend she knew what was going on. I genuinely can't comprehend the stupidity of writing the story like that. It is excruciating to have to wade through it. Let's talk about the writing. Haig's prose reads like it was written for maybe 8 to 12-year-olds. But even then, there's none of the humor or imagination or expressiveness you'd expect from authors for that age group. The writing is embarrassingly simplistic and inane for the most part. Matt Haig cannot write good sentences. He is not good at describing things, and he is not creative in the slightest. That's not a good combination. It's just an incredibly poorly written book. I mentioned A Gentleman in Moscow earlier, and Haig is quite similar to Amor Towles in some ways, like the saccharine tone and the cloying smugness of it all. Towles is much worse for that, to be fair. One thing they both display in abundance is the clunky, overwrought simile. Here are just a few examples of Haig's many, many cumbersome similes. Her mind felt loud, like a Sturm und Drang symphony, as if the ghost of a German composer was trapped inside her mind, conjuring chaos and intensity. These regrets were quite strong and bold, and played in her head like an ongoing fortissimo chord in a Haydn concerto. She just picked up the odd word or phrase that floated into her mind like croutons in minestrone. It was, at first, kind of threatening, as if she was Hercules facing the many-headed Hydra who wanted to kill him. Yes, thanks for that clarification on the intentions of the Hydra, Matt, because that simile would have felt completely unmoored without that addition. These similes fill me with secondhand embarrassment, like a glass being filled with milk from a carton of milk. They hurt my head as if someone is hammering me in the head with a hammer. They make me groan as if I am an old woman getting out of a chair, and also that old woman groans every time she gets out of a chair. There are so many lines in this book where you think, how did this make it past an editor? Like this one, where Mrs. Elm is speaking and then we get this dialogue tag. Mrs. Elm said in a whisper, for added power and intimacy. Yeah, thanks, Matt. I would have been really confused as to why she was whispering if you hadn't explained it. There's a lot of cliché in the book, a lot of blandness and banality, a refusal to stray from a set of fairly insipid references that have been done time and time again. Quotes from Robert Frost or Marcus Aurelius, a reference to Schrodinger's cat. But by far the most egregious example of this is the game of chess being used as a recurring motif. This is just so overdone. This idea that chess represents life, you have the powerful king and queen, you have the little pawns, blah blah blah. It's just vapid. This bumbling analogy starts on the first page of the book and we come back to it intermittently. Here are a few quotes about chess. "The rook is my favourite piece," she said. "It's the one that you think you don't have to watch out for. It is straightforward. You keep your eye on the queen and the knights and the bishop because they are the sneaky ones. But it's the rook that often gets you. The straightforward is never quite what it seems." Nora realized Mrs. Elm was probably not talking just about chess. "A pawn is the most magical piece of all." Of course it is. Mrs. Elm was right. The game wasn't over. No player should give up if there were pieces still left on the board. What are you talking about? That literally happens all the time in chess. Have you never seen a game of chess? One last thing on Haig's writing that I have to mention is the song written by rock star Nora. I won't bore you by setting the scene too much. You just need to know that this trendy podcaster guy, as Haig painfully outlines him, is interviewing rock star Nora and he's gushing about one of her songs, which is called Howl. He compares it to The Cure, The Carpenters, Frank Ocean, Tame Impala. A list of 4 things like that is just so unwieldy. Haig's writing instincts are just awful. Anyway, the key thing is that Howl is described by this podcaster guy as having very abstract lyrics. Okay, just keep that in mind. So here are some of the lyrics to Howl. "To the winter forest and nowhere to go, this girl runs from all she knows. The pressure rises to the top. The pressure rises. It won't stop. They want your body. They want your soul. They want fake smiles. That's rock and roll. The wolves surround you. A fever dream. The wolves surround you, so start the scream. Howl into the night, howl until the light. Howl, your turn to fight. Howl, just make it right. Howl, 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 motherfucker. You can't fight forever, you have to comply. If your life isn't working, you have to ask why. The next part is spoken, in brackets. Remember, when we were young enough not to fear tomorrow, or to mourn yesterday, and we were just us, and time was just now, and we were in life, not rising through like arms in a sleeve, because we had time to breathe. Okay, I can't do any more of that. To paraphrase Douglas Adams, those lyrics are abstract in the same way that bricks float in the air. Let's talk about the characters, and this won't take long because there's really only one character in this book. There isn't even a pretense at developing any other character beyond a one-dimensional prop. So let's just talk about the protagonist, Nora Seed. Get it? Seed. The potential to grow. Do you get it? Do you understand? Do you understand? So there are a number of problems with the main character. Overall, she is dull, annoying, unlikable. She apparently, though, has the talent of about 100 different extremely talented people. Potential Olympian, rock star, scientist, etc. Yeah, that's really relatable for everybody reading the book, Matt. Good job. That'll be a big boost to the self-esteem of your target audience, people with depression. So Nora is very immature. And I don't mean because she hasn't reached her potential or anything, although that's what Haig thinks. We'll get to that later. She's just very childish and sees the world in a juvenile way. She's 35, but the book reads like she's a teenager. She's also a bit mean-spirited and miserable. This is evidenced most clearly when she's with Dylan, the guy who's really into dogs. She just spends that whole visit looking down on this goofy simpleton, whom she basically sees as a dog. She can't stand his enthusiasm or his easygoing nature, but of course she can't articulate what she actually wants either. That's a particularly frustrating section to read. Nora is also just a bit thick, another trait that makes her infuriating to spend time with. One thing that happens again and again in the book is something is explained, and we get it, because it's not like Haig is dealing with any complex topics here, or presenting anything in this baroque, impenetrable language. But Nora is too stupid to get it. So she says, "What?" her favourite word, and Mrs. Elm has to explain it again, in more detail, and we have to read that. Then we have the way Nora is presented, the way we learn about who she is. We don't learn about her from how she reacts to the new lives, because that would make sense, and it might be narratively and dramatically coherent and satisfying. Instead, we're spoon-fed her rather dreary thoughts and feelings. Then she goes into a life, fumbles around a bit, complains, comes back out, complains some more. The other way we learn about her is when characters recite basic facts about her to her face in these unwieldy exposition dumps, saying things like, "You have a cat," and "You were in a band." At the end, I suppose we're supposed to think that there's been some character development, that there's been this cathartic realization about her root life, but Haig doesn't pull it off at all, mostly because of the insulting way he depicts depression as something that can be made to simply vanish if we shift our perspective. Let's talk about the tone for a minute. The quote on the cover from the Sunday Times says that this book is filled with warmth and humour. I don't know what book they were reading because there is no humour in here. And I don't mean that Haig tries to be funny and fails. I just genuinely can't even see an attempt at anything comedic. And as for warmth, the only decent warmth you'd get out of this pablum is by throwing it on the fire. Even though the tone of the book is relentlessly schmaltzy and mawkish, it's also somehow simultaneously cold and detached. There's no emotion in it. No openness or vulnerability, no evocation of empathy, no pathos. Everything is reduced to hackneyed and sentimental aphorisms, like fortune cookies made by an AI that's been trained on the Pinterest pages of tradwife influencers. It has a very patronizing tone as well because it feels so dumbed down, although I think that's just Haig's level. I don't think he can really go upwards from what he's given us here. But the book also has this kind of unearned smugness, as if he's actually imparting valuable, ethically righteous wisdom. This awful saccharine line about flowers really sums up the tone, as though the flowers weren't just colours, but part of a language, notes in a glorious floral melody, as powerful as Chopin, silently communicating the breathtaking majesty of life itself. Alright, that's enough for the review, I think. We could be here all day, but let's get into the politics. We'll start by talking about mental health and self-help. So Matt Haig has a history of depression himself that he has spoken about openly and bravely, and a lot of his work deals with that. He has also talked about the stigma he felt around therapy and medication, and how he felt he had to conquer depression without those things. And that's where things get a bit murky. When the Midnight Library received some criticism for the way it handled depression, Haig came out and issued a clarification on Twitter that Nora is not clinically depressed, she's situationally depressed. She's unhappy because things are going badly for her. And he does mention that in the book as well, although only briefly. He never really digs into Nora's depression at all, in fact. It's quite strange that this subject is so studiously avoided, since mental health is the main subject of the book. It's the reason for its existence. This book is mental health self-help in the guise of a novel. So whatever his intentions, I do believe that in this book, Matt Haig has presented us with a superficial and facile depiction of depression that trivializes it and that could be genuinely harmful to anyone who reads this book who is suffering from depression. Haig is not a mental health expert. He has no qualifications or expertise when it comes to, for example, recommending treatment options. And by far the biggest problem with this book is that on numerous occasions, therapy and medication are synonymous with failure. The whole mechanic of the book rests on Nora gathering evidence in each of these lives to assess whether it's a success or a failure. And every single time therapy or medication is mentioned, she's gone. That life is not worth living. The best life that she manages to find at the end, she finds no antidepressants in the medicine drawer and breathes a huge sigh of relief. The decision by Haig to correlate mental health treatment with failure as if it's something that precludes happiness is completely irresponsible. And the thing is, Haig had such a good opportunity here to show that, okay, maybe Nora thinks like that at the beginning, but then her mind is changed when she sees that going through treatment has helped other versions of herself find some peace and happiness, for example. She could have grown, changed her opinions, and then gone back to her root life and looked for help. But no, we get none of that. We just get this scolding guilt trip anytime treatment is mentioned. It's really reckless from Haig, and considering how many people have read this book, I don't think it's outlandish to imagine that this approach of his may have done actual harm to people in terms of generating or sustaining a stigma around getting treatment for mental health problems. Self-help isn't supposed to be aimed at people with serious mental illness. I mean, 99% of self-help is bollocks anyway, but even when it is helpful, you're talking about things like developing good habits, making slight attitude adjustments, all the little things that can help us deal with work, relationships, stress, your temper. And Haig's message here is very much self-help. You have to help yourself. Just live. Just decide to live. You have this inane quote that comes up numerous times in the book. The only way to learn is to live. There's another quote in there from the fictional Hollywood actor Ryan Bailey, who has a line in a movie that goes, "Life is for living, cupcake." And it's funny because that's clearly supposed to be understood as trite, banal advice from this airhead, but it's really not any less profound than the only way to learn is to live. So Haig's message is just be yourself. Just deal with depression by thinking about your potential and by doing yoga and by reading Matt Haig's books. And that'll be enough. And that's a load of bollocks, Matt. Some people need external help. Some people need therapy. Some people need medication. Everyone needs a support network of some kind in order to navigate life. Even before getting into specific mental illnesses that make it so much harder for people to deal with it. We can't do it alone, nor should we have to, and nor should we be made feel that we have to. Haig even arrives at this point himself, but he can't see it through his own bias. In her speech, Nora says, "If your life is rotten, it will be rotten no matter what you do. The damp rots the whole useless thing." And that's what depression does. It rots your life from the inside. It taints everything good. It infects every part of your being. And telling people that they can navigate such a horrific illness just by utilizing some bullshit fridge magnet wisdom is craven and insulting and negligent. So I guess the counterpoint is, well, maybe some people actually benefited from the message of this book. People who are going through a bit of situational depression, who are just a bit down, a bit flat, dealing with some something difficult in their life at the moment. Does that mean those people are stupid? Is it a message that is categorically not worth taking on board? If we assume that Haig has good intentions and he's not just a cynical grifter, is he just clumsily trying to get across the very broad idea that Nora realizes her true life isn't so shitty after all? That pursuing material success is bollocks, as she says in her non-inspirational speech. Well, there are a few issues with that. Firstly, the ostensible message of the book, as stated by Nora, that success can't be measured by material things like medals or money, is not the message of the story that Haig tells. Quite the opposite. And just saying that that's the message doesn't make it so. And we'll look at that more closely in a minute when we talk about the conservative worldview. Secondly, the book is about depression, even if Haig tries not to examine it in any detail. That's what it's about. Mentioning the word situational once or twice, or issuing clarifications on Twitter, doesn't really cut it. You have written a self-help book for people with depression, and it contains bad and irresponsible advice. That is on you, Matt, not the reader. So look, if somebody who's having a hard time does get some solace from this rather fluffy and insubstantial book, that's great. But I feel that any benefit to those people would be massively outweighed by how damaging this message could be to someone dealing with serious mental illness. And for that reason, I think the way Matt Haig handles mental health in this book is indefensible. Lots of the reviews for this book mention that it was given to them as a gift by someone who knew they were struggling a bit. And I feel really sorry for those people who, first of all, have to read a really bad book, but then also expose themselves to this patronizing, unhelpful message, and then also probably think, is this what my friends think of me? That I'm some dreary wet blanket like Nora? That I just need to cheer up, smile more, do yoga, think positively? There is a more cynical side of me that would suggest that maybe the function of this book is as kind of an ego boost for people who don't have depression. They read this hokey shite and then say, firstly, oh, this would be so great for my friend who's a bit sad. And then secondly, they get this kind of feeling of moral superiority, of knowing they have a job, they have their shit together. They've never tried to kill themselves. They've never needed to ask anyone for help. They're not broken or weak. They're self-sufficient. They can help themselves. Now, I'm not going to explicitly say that that's why Haig wrote the book, but there is part of me that thinks it reads like that. Let's move on and talk about conservatism. I don't know how Matt Haig defines himself politically, and I don't care. I'd be surprised if it's something that he thinks deeply about. But what is certain is that this book he wrote is a fable. It's a text expounding moral and political views. And as a fable, it is unquestionably profoundly conservative and reactionary. Let's take a look at a number of conservative tenets that feature in the book. First, optimism, or this idea that things could be worse, so stop complaining. This philosophy is summed up in the book when Nora says, the prison wasn't the place, but the perspective. This argument, of course, completely ignores things like material conditions, physical or psychological illnesses, or anything else external that causes people difficulties, regardless of how cheery their perspective is. This is a really prevalent ideological project of the neoliberal centre-right. It's embodied by charlatan propagandist Steven Pinker, self-interested oligarch Bill Gates, and others. Essentially, it involves very powerful people obfuscating these fundamental problems like structural inequality, exploitation of the global south, etc., and gaslighting us into thinking everything is great, things are improving, they've never been better. And then there's a lot of spurious data that's thrown around to defend the status quo, to show how capitalism has in fact liberated and enriched us, and to proffer only minor technocratic fixes to existing issues. Now, this ideology is complete and utter horseshit, and it's a transparent reactionary tactic implemented by elites to dismiss criticism and to stifle progressive movements for change. And that's an interesting way to see Haig's treatment of depression and the way he utilizes this philosophy of optimism, framing this, hey, just do it yourself, just live your life message to quash any material movement towards change in mental health terms, i.e. seeking help, getting therapy, taking medication. So much of the book is essentially this grim morality tale where dead family members are paraded in front of Nora, as if to say, see how much worse things could be? I bet you want to go back to your shitty little root life now, don't you? And that leads us to another conservative ideal, that of personal moral responsibility. Haig posits a world where nothing seems to happen outside of Nora's control, or at least outside of her responsibility. She's responsible for all of her successes and failures, and seemingly for things like the death of loved ones, the divorce of her parents, which Haig uses as crass ways to paint those lives as undesirable. Assigning moral responsibility to people for their conditions and their suffering is a classic conservative trope. Because if Nora is situationally depressed, as Haig claims, then it's external life stuff beyond her control that's making her unhappy. Yet she's to blame for it. She has to take action at the end of the book. But again, taking action doesn't mean seeking help or anything. Just, choosing to live or whatever. This is one of the most malicious ideological strands of conservatism. Ignoring systemic injustice or bad luck and foregoing basic human compassion, because we all make mistakes, and then using this bad choices narrative to opt out of displaying any kind of empathy or fulfilling any kind of social contract. Let's talk about potential and how conservatives judge people's worth. Haig kind of tries to say at the end that the message of the book is that love is necessary. But there's no evidence for this in the text. He's just tacked it on at the end. Much more fitting to the story he presents is when he says that potential is what makes life worth living. Now she saw the kinds of things she could do when she put herself to work. She just needed potential. It was her messy struggle, a beautiful messy struggle. And death is the opposite of possibility, i.e. life is all about potential. So the key to defeating depression, and the thing which bestows value upon a life, is potential. But potential for what? Material success? The thing that the book tries to say isn't important. The message that success can't be measured by material gain, money, medals, whatever, is mentioned at the end of the book, but it is not the message of the book. It's exactly the opposite. Haig very clearly shows that there are material parameters that define and exemplify success and happiness. The potential not to be single, but to be married and have a family. The potential not to be a stoner layabout, but to have a job and be productive. The potential not to be in therapy, but to help yourself. Because things like being single or needing help or taking drugs equate to an unsuccessful attempt at life. Those things are hallmarks of unworthy people, like the versions of herself that Nora finds unworthy. Incidentally, I saw a comment online that I agree with that says, it feels like Nora isn't even expected to do anything with all this potential back in her root life at the end of the book. She just needed that self-esteem boost of seeing proof that she was always smart, she was always talented, and could have done so many amazing things. Because a normal life that could only ever lead to moderate material success just isn't good enough for conservatives. When conservatives talk about potential, what they mean is the potential to be useful, the potential for social utility, to be a unit of labor producing capital, or the potential to marry and breed. That's what defines success. Nora's only happy life that she finds among thousands is one where she hasn't really pursued any personal goals like rock stardom, but the one in which she is a devoted wife and mother. The only things, of course, that can bring a woman true happiness. Husband, child, dog, wealth. A happy, heteronormative life, a worthy life. Because this is the thing, a life is not worth anything intrinsically to a conservative unless it's their own. A life is only valuable if it has the potential to produce capital, or to produce other human beings who will go on to produce capital or other human beings, and so on. The next conservative trope we see is a kind of general misanthropy and a moral judgment of people by material criteria. Haig has Nora come to the realization through her experience that most people are bad. Nora wanted to live in a world where no cruelty existed, but the only worlds she had available to her were worlds with humans in them. He was a good person, and good people were rare. Not only that, but the book is populated with flimsy characters who are presented as very simplistically either good or bad. Because another way Nora judges if a life is good or not is the company she keeps. Are they good or bad people? And she can decide this pretty much instantly. But wait, surely you can't decide if a person is good or bad after just a few minutes in their company. Well, you can if A, it's a person written by Matt Haig, because there's not much to investigate, and B, if your criteria for goodness or badness are incredibly simplistic, shallow, and conservative. For example, a bad person is the stoner conspiracy theorist flatmate in the Australia chapter. Incidentally, this part of the book is particularly painful. The poems, the conspiracy theory stuff, the attempts at credibly describing a stoner lifestyle, it's all so banal and poorly worded. Haig reminds me a lot of Richard Osman. They both have this kind of twee, puritanical, religion teacher style outlook on life. So anyway, the stoner is bad because she takes drugs, whereas a good person is Ash, for example, the wealthy, stable surgeon and father that Nora finds herself married to. See, moral judgment is easy if you remove pesky inconveniences like critical thinking, basic human decency, and empathy. And while we're at it, let's talk about the book's complete lack of empathy, another conservative trait. Firstly, it's clear that Haig, strangely, doesn't seem to have much empathy for depression sufferers in general, and certainly none for depressives who seek therapeutic or medicinal solutions. But apart from that, there's also a complete lack of empathy for and interest in any character other than the root Nora. The lives, personalities, and experiences of the multiverse Noras, for example, are not even considered. They are just ciphers. They're avatars for Nora to try out, to judge, and to abandon when she concludes that they are morally weak. There are a few other reactionary highlights in the book. Firstly, there's that really weird white savior bit with the young lad getting involved in knife crime because Nora's piano lessons hadn't kept him off the street. That was bizarre. There's another moment where Ash says that people are lonelier the more they're connected on social media. No, social media shite is a symptom of the way we live, not a cause. It's because of our fractured society that people seek solace in social media. This is a classic conservative reaction, completely ignorant or willfully oblivious to the material causes of social problems. And then finally, there are all the snippets of conservative philosophy. There are so many references in the text to philosophy, mostly to very well-known philosophers. This element is treated as superficially as all the others. I would say 3 is the maximum number of tabs that Matt Haig had open during his literal hours of research for this book. Anyway, a lot of the ideas of the likes of Thoreau and Marcus Aurelius, which were varied and certainly don't all fall under conservatism, are fairly bastardized and misrepresented into these reductive, vapid aphorisms that Haig uses to espouse a kind of stiff upper lip stoicism or a do-it-yourself rugged individualism. So, since he's written such a reactionary book, can we deduce that Matt Haig is a conservative, cynically putting forward these fairly murky moral arguments? Or is he well-meaning, maybe just a bit too simple-minded to connect some of the dots? So like a lot of centrist dad types, he ends up defaulting to a lot of kind of fluffy reactionary stuff. Hardline Tory, self-interested grifter, witless oaf. That is the question. But it's not a very important one, because the damage is done. This book is out in the world. It's been read by millions, and its irresponsible message cannot be rescinded. So I guess I'll finish with some advice. Don't buy this book. Don't read this book. Don't recommend this book to anyone, especially not to anyone who is suffering from depression. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Good luck.